So Andrea shared her CV with me and with Alexis, and you can see this is her cotton wolf company. She is the kind of principal director there of this, I believe, a publishing company. So that's really cool that I had not known about. And Andrea is a phase 2 PhD student in the ES PhD department, focusing her research on narwhals. And I recently heard that she is going to be part of this expedition out in the Arctic Circle this summer, which is really cool and looks really exciting. And then also what I recently heard as well is that she'll be volunteering with the Quiet Sound Project, which is a project looking at reducing noise impacts. And so Andrea is really focused on bioacoustics and the Arctic and narwhals, and yeah, looking forward to hearing more about her plans in this talk. I can put all those links to everything that Andrea will be doing in the chat too.
Thanks for the great introduction, Mike. Would you like me to take it away?
Go for it. Yeah.
All right. Okay, if it's all right, I'm going to share my screen. I want to make sure that everyone has a really good idea of what the narwhal is and its habitat. And I also, so this particular really brief video clip is about a minute long, but it gives you an opportunity to observe them in their habitat and hear some of their sounds. And I have to say that it is courtesy of, amazingly, the Cornell Ornithology Lab. So I've learned that when they are out on Arctic expedition for seabirds research, they occasionally get these amazing videos of other things and choose to share them broadly, which is wonderful. So if you can see my screen, I'm going to go ahead and share the narwhal with you. So cheers to the Cornell Lab for sharing more than just birds. And I am going to stop that share, and I'm going to then pull up my slides. So for those of you who are birders, isn't it fascinating to start to hear the whale voices as compared to the bird voices? I've found so many similarities, and I am certainly not an acoustic expert at this point, but I am fascinated looking at the spectrograms of the different species and comparing them. So now we're going to move over to some slides. How's that look? Okay, great. Okay, again, thanks a lot for the opportunity to share this with you and to hopefully get into some conversation about international conservation. I want to make sure, first of all, that I share my acknowledgements with you. I'm speaking to you today from Seattle. I gratefully acknowledge and pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples on whose ancestral homelands I dwell, and their connections to the land that preserve, nourish, and shape our community, which resides on unceded Coast Salish land. I also want to provide a white settler scholar acknowledgement, considering that I am the other who is going to be skulking into the Arctic, home of Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. I'm seeking to accomplish research that does not contribute to imperialism or colonial structures, and that requires thoughtful reflection on the part of the settler scholar according to decolonizing methodologies. So I've situated in decolonization theory alongside metabioacoustic theory to stay accountable to decolonizing self, keeping a sharp eye also on Arctic political agendas that may diminish the role of Indigenous ways of knowing. So this is my lens as I approach my research. And I can't discuss the Arctic without discussing the IPCC report, the latest iteration of which was just released yesterday, telling us plainly it leaves little room for anything other than immediate transformation of the Anthropocene. So I want to just spend a few minutes looking at some of the graphics that they shared, especially as it relates to the Arctic region. So they use 5 integrative reasons for concern in their reporting consistently that provide a framework for summarizing key impacts and risks across sectors and regions. And they were introduced in the IPCC third assessment report. So this is not a surprise to anyone here, I'm sure, but the purple is extremely high concern, and the Arctic is in that realm, as are unique and threatened systems in general around the world. And I also, although it's not my area of research, want to draw attention to the bottom far left purple line, which is warm water corals. So for those that are studying warm water corals, there's certainly also alarm bells going off everywhere in the ocean. So to me, this is where we have to situate to have a discussion about international conservation. And in this very sensitive habitat dwells the narwhal. So I wanted to have a moment of fun facts as related to the narwhal because it is certainly the stuff of legend. Monodon monoceros, 1 tooth, 1 horn, although as we're going to discuss in a moment, this is not necessarily true. And in Old Norse is where the casual name narwhal evolved. Old corpse, in the water, a whale, whale corpse. This name was given because as the narwhal ages, its skin pigment lightens. So when they get older, they are a very dull gray. When they're young, like these are youngsters here, older adolescents, they have a brown, patchy kind of skin color. So the casual name brings up a lot of fun tales, and probably none better accomplished than what are shared in Moby Dick. I wanted to point out a few things that Herman Melville came up with in cetology when the idea of shaping the identity of this particular whale was being discussed. So in the cetology of Moby Dick, the narwhal is a spouting fish with a horizontal tail. There's great discussion in Moby Dick, if you spent time there, about what a fish is and is not. So in this realm, it remained a fish for Moby Dick. And it was horned only on the sinister side, that being the left side. And the spiral horn was known to be, and this is well beyond Moby Dick, an antidote against poison. And this was something that actually took hold for several centuries. And this horn was brought back to royalty and considered of great value. So there are many, many stories of the animal being killed simply for its tusk. In truth, modern scientists and some really innovative dentists have determined that the tusk is an erupted tooth. This is a toothed whale. The male and female, although most people think that only males have tusks in the narwhal groups, female tusks will occasionally have erupted tusks as well, but they all have unerupted tusks, teeth, for lack of a better term. So fascinating that we don't really know for sure which are male and female just by looking at them casually. The only other whale in this family is the beluga. And as you've probably recently read, these two families do get together on occasion, and there are lots and lots of social media stories about the narluga, those who have crossed over family lines and made it. Clearly, they are endemic to the high Arctic. They are dwellers of dense ice pack. Their home is generally deep and dark. They are known regularly to dive 1,500 meters and more. Our instruments can't follow them well at this time, so we don't know just how far they actually do dive. They are highly reliant on sound. The question comes up a lot when I talk with people about narwhals. Why study the narwhal's voice in the high Arctic? So I've been trying to understand what shifts policy. I've been studying what might be championed as big Arctic wins so far in this millennium, as well as the victories from the 20th century, including the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. And I think it comes down to this: science shifts policy after story stirs human hearts. I think this is why so many humans are familiar with voices like the young climate activist Greta Thunberg. So the narwhal, being highly sensitive to sound and so dependent on sound, is iconic as related to what is so quickly transpiring with our ecosystems around the globe. As you probably know, it uses echolocation to image the underwater environment and to locate prey. It whistles and clicks to communicate, attract mates, coordinate movements. And it can create, like most whales, intense clicks with a set of air sacs in its nasal passages, so what we commonly refer to as blowholes. The narwhal has a dorsal ridge, but it doesn't have a dorsal fin. And the melon is an additional organ on its forehead, which focuses sound, helping to tighten the beam. A study documenting the first known examples of sequence use in narwhals was just published in 2020. And even more exciting, a paper in 2021 suggests evidence of stereotyped contact calls. So really excited to see where this research goes. This is my study area. I went ahead and drew in, because I'm not good at using the whiteboard in Zoom. So I went ahead and pre-drew, circled my area there initially where I'll be this summer. That's Svalbard it's a Norwegian archipelago. And then I'd like to go from there northward. Svalbard is just 600 miles from the North Pole. It's a place of deep fjords, snow-capped mountains, and massive glaciers. It's best known as the northernmost place in the world with a permanent human population. However, multiple indigenous settlements as well as ice bases also exist farther north. So as you see my arrows pointing up, these are my areas of interest beyond Svalbard, because these particular populations of the narwhals have really not been studied. Most of the research has come from the Canadian pods because the submarine grounds are so much easier to get to in the Nunavut territory in Canada. So the issues that I'm looking into involve the rapid increase in noise in the ocean. Clearly, it shouldn't be an unknown at this point, but scientists are still working hard to press on the issue that since rapid development of industry, the oceans have become noisier. This particular paper that I've referenced here was just published at the end of 2021 in the journal Science, gathering an immense amount of data telling us clearly our oceans are noisier. So as shared already, the narwhal is incredibly sensitive to sound, reacting to an icebreaker vessel from as much as 50 kilometers away when sound levels are only just above ambient. When only a few kilometers from sound disturbances, narwhals demonstrate the ability to detect signals, including ship noise and airgun pulses embedded in background noise, responding with significantly reduced buzzing rates, which is of course immense concern. Beyond hearing sensitivity and damage to the auditory system, research has demonstrated that sound can cause communication masking, stress response, and behavioral effects, including panic and stranding. Writing for the New York Times Climate Forward newsletter on April 1st, so just a few days ago, journalist Manuela Andreoni, when discussing an interview with a young Russian climate activist who was forced to give up his activism and flee for his life, had this to say: "The war in Ukraine has upended policies meant to fight global warming, and at the same time, made oil companies almost giddy with new optimism." So this is a frightening moment in which our friends of the sea find themselves, and certainly complex for the human experiment as well, because dependence on our natural resources is shifting dramatically as instability in the globe accentuates from where we gain our natural resources, where our energy resources come from. Just as a reminder of what is involved with seismic survey activity, active sonar, which is also used heavily by the military, is the human version of echolocation. So seismic surveying, including a type of sonar, creates images of the Earth's crust for geological study as we explore for energy. Controlled explosions of compressed air make low frequency pulses directed into the seafloor. So it's an uncomfortable state for those that live in the water. As global mechanisms move slowly to protect fragile ecosystems, the economic drivers pressing on the Arctic region's identity in the 21st century continue to churn. Just off Greenland's coast, mining giants, including De Beers, are surveying for marine diamonds. Other mining companies are searching for rare earth minerals, copper, titanium, platinum, and even anthracite, a rock similar to those brought back by the astronauts from the moon. According to the Greenland Mineral Resources Authority, there are currently 5 mineral exploitation licenses, 13 prospecting licenses, 54 mineral exploration licenses, 23 scientific licenses, 6 exploration licenses on special conditions, 37 exclusive small-scale licenses, and 8 small-scale licenses without exclusive rights that exist just in that territory. On the Norwegian continental shelf, 24 energy and petrochemical companies currently operate. The Norwegian Petroleum Directorate reported 15.8 billion standard cubic meters of proven and unproven petroleum resources on the Norwegian continental shelf alone. So Norway is planning to offer new licenses to drill for oil and gas in its oceans, including previously unexplored acreage in the Arctic. This is very disappointing news. Access to new attractive exploration acreage is a pillar in the government's policy for further development of the petroleum industry. This is a recent quote just this past week from Minister of Energy and Petroleum of the Norwegian Oil and Gas Ministry. So there's another issue at play as we consider what's going on here in the high Arctic. I'm looking at this particular framework because I feel that we need to make sure we are considering traditional ways of knowing, even regardless of the good that we all intend to do. I think especially as a white Western scholar skulking into this area, I need to remember the voices that I've known for so long, what's occurring in this place. A little bit of history I think is important when we consider whose Arctic we're talking about. It can be said that environmental concerns dictated first steps toward circumpolar Arctic cooperation. And yet the people most skilled at recognizing and interpreting natural indicators of change and accompanying consequences continue to be relegated to observer roles, while states possessing the power to enact laws dictate global climate change strategies. So a little history about the Arctic Council and how states gain power in the Arctic and how that power is shifting dramatically in this moment. The Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy of 1991 was the precursor to creation of the Arctic Council. And it was negotiated as a tool to codify international cooperation for protection, preservation of the Arctic environment. The 8 Arctic countries that negotiated the strategy did enshrine within its verbiage recognition of Indigenous peoples' contributions to protection of the Arctic environment, acknowledging their special relationship with the land. The 8 governments committed in the declaration's verbiage to specifically include the following organizations as observers in the document. I won't say them all right now, but these are the Indigenous permanent members, of the Arctic Council. And a quick note, the states that are member states of the Arctic Council include Canada, the Kingdom of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, the Russian Federation, Sweden, the United States, and the Indigenous peoples organizations that I just mentioned. As a note, in consideration of the recent unrest globally and the devastation and atrocities that we are seeing occur in Eastern Europe, the European Union is not a member of the Arctic Council and has seen its application for observer status consistently rejected, while China's application for observer status was granted in 2014. I want to mention what's noted on my slide here is the common heritage of humankind principle, and keep this in mind in relation to the policies that are already intact in the Arctic and in consideration of how they may evolve quickly based on the different pressures that the globe is experiencing in this moment. The CHP is included in UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And it was proposed to the United Nations General Assembly in 1967 as a principle to attempt to promote equitable governance of the deep ocean below 200 meters, known as the deep seabed. So that's a lot of history about the place, but because it's so politically charged and it's so sensitive, I think it's essential that we consider what impacts it in this moment. So to really get into what I'm interested in, my focus, acoustics has certainly been noted as an early warning indicator. And yet sound patterns of the high Arctic soundscape, habitat of the narwhal, are understudied. So the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, which is part of NAMCO, stated in a report just released at the end of 2021 that they would like to see several early warning indicators for marine mammals, which is exactly what I'm interested in and would like to do. So I'm interested in acoustic indices developed through listening to narwhals as rapidly evolving acoustic habitats can inform policy quickly, in my view. And I want to bring up something that comes up often in acoustics discussions, which is, well, naturally, the Arctic is a very noisy place because there are always calvings and earthquakes and ice is noisy and there's just a lot going on. But a recent paper, this was just published, I'm so excited to see it, takes into consideration our responses, any living organism's responses, this one in particular related to narwhals, to natural versus unnaturally occurring sounds. And this paper highlights that we really need to think carefully and study what those responses are, what we're used to, for lack of a better term, and what we're not used to. And this goes for every creature. So they looked at this particular calving event, which based on their record, probably produced one of the loudest and broadest natural sounds in the Arctic. And they believe that these calving events are that, the loudest and broadest examples of natural sounds in this place. But again, the way in which we receive acoustic energy from sound levels of environmental and biological sounds is probably quite different than the ways in which we receive and also analyze anthropogenic sounds. So this is really starting to focus my interest. And I'm using the acoustic niche hypothesis to move forward in my exploration. So a little history on this particular lens. In formulating this hypothesis, AUNE, musician and bioacoustician Bernie Krause credited ancient humans with a keen understanding of what he called creature sounds, noting this wisdom as essential to human survival. Krause saw these humans as possessing the ability to distinguish the subtle variances of sounds between many habitats. Krause postulated at this point that ambient sound in a given habitat functions as an orchestra, each living organism occupying its own place. Each species has its own acoustic niche and a frequency spectrum and/or the moment. The biological health of a habitat could be evaluated through the lens of its acoustic makeup, according to this idea. So to me, AUNE adds an oral measurement to an organism's ecoscape, defined with axes corresponding to environmental factors, influencing performance, elements that shape conditions that allow a species to exist indefinitely. Now, this probably sounds familiar. Using ANH, a probable expansion of Evelyn Hutchinson's ecological niche concept, I intend to investigate the narwhal's acoustic habitat to understand whether the animal's extreme sensitivity to sound alongside its dependence on this faculty will result in its rapid demise based on recent substantial increases in levels of anthropophony in the high Arctic. In doing so, I really enjoy this picture. I want to take into account my role as auditor, and I think this is so important in the study of acoustics, especially bioacoustics. And then also in keeping with my desire to really situate in decolonization theory too. I feel that listening inclusively and entirely is illuminated in post-colonial theory and reflected in decolonizing methodologies. As with any story form, considering the sonic story of a place too narrowly and through particular forms of language that diminish one over another may inadvertently continue to create structures of power through Western research paradigms. And also, this is really important to me, isolate and characterize an individual voice versus interpreting an acoustic habitat in its entirety. So my research is focused on development of acoustic indices that situate traditional ways of knowing alongside Western scholarship. I think this is going to give me a frame to not only think in the realm of ANH, but to think about all the voices that already are a part of and understand this habitat. So I am fascinated by synthetic acoustic ecology. And this has just come up recently in my research, although I've seen that it's gone back to about 2018, where you're really leaning into A-life and the deep learning capabilities of what our newer technologies can do to situate interactions differently and to really hold me accountable as the listener, as the hearer, to try to situate my biases and to really look up objectivity with objectivity, or well, technically to listen with objectivity. So this is the realm in which I'm really dipping right now. And I am such a novice, but I am fascinated and I cannot wait to see what I learn next as related to some of these new opportunities with A-life. And there are some really fun data sets that I've discovered in some of the resources management sites. So I'm playing with those, and I've only found a few even related to cetaceans at this moment, but I'm on the hunt. So thank you for listening. I've arrived to my closing question, which, as I said, just kind of really tends to haunt me as I work in this particular realm. I want to just situate it here. Several NGOs are aligned and involved directly or indirectly with the Arctic Council's member states, with the working groups, and with the observers. Many nonprofits and NGOs organize and operate from the lens of the Arctic as a global commons. So this reflects that ever increasing interest from parties south of the 66 North Parallel, or what we consider the Arctic Circle. So my question is, does this help or hinder opportunities to mediate impacts and risks? Should this area be left to those who are a part of it, or is it now a global commons? And should the entire world be involved in sorting what we do next? So I'm going to leave you with that question. I would love to discuss it a little bit if you have time. And I'm really grateful for you spending this time with me.
Thanks, Andrea. Great talk. Josh, did you want to say something?
I was also going to say thank you. That was a great presentation. And I really like the perspective that you bring into your analysis and your research.
Thanks, Josh. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I also, I don't know if I missed anything when I joined, but I thought the question you had in the end, you know, that idea of help and hindrance, and sort of, should we involve everyone, the entire world, or should we just involve the people who are, you know, within that common area that you mentioned, or people who are partly in the council? I just thought that was a great question, because it's interesting, because all of the things you mentioned sort of impacts like the whole ethic itself, and so that in itself could involve a lot of parties involved, and, you know, stakeholders and the locals and observers, like you mentioned. But it's also something that you really would want to get more information on the people who are in the area specifically. So I thought the idea of the indigenous knowing was great to add to it.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, you know, fortunately, I don't have to answer that question other than for myself in this moment. But, you know, we really can't disconnect ourselves anymore from anything. And it raises this question every time I think about the fact that technically this is not my home. I'm the other, not just as related to the animal, but certainly related to the indigenous population. So, you know, as more and more I'm finding the Arctic Circle Secretariat, the Arctic Circle Foundation with its secretariat in Iceland. I don't know if any of you are familiar, not where I'm going, not the Arctic Circle with the capital T, but the Arctic Circle with little t. It's funny. They're almost the same, but they're different. The Arctic Circle with the small t, they gather immense, powerful populations together to discuss what's going on in the Arctic. And most of the time I think it's great, but, you know, I've looked at their board of directors and it is very much tied to oil, to powerful nations that may not support human rights. Let me be direct. They don't support human rights. And so, you know, who should be doing what? Who's in charge?
It's a very interesting question. And yeah, like I'm thinking of like you were saying, acknowledging that it's not our lands, but then the world is thinking that it's a world commons, and that for me seems like an excuse to intervene or to colonize the Arctic in some way, and but there's so many ways that the world can take action to protect the Arctic, and also the narwhal whales. Like when you share that image of oil offshore drilling, I'm thinking that the many implications of why that is happening, and thinking about how the oil industry is looking as a plan B, from seeing their drops in profits, because now we are trying to phase out fossil fuels for energy and having to move to renewable energies. But then the oil industry, what it's doing, it's thinking of investing more in the growth in plastic production. So for that, they need oil and petrochemicals. So I'm thinking that as a plastic reduction advocate, like seeing your presentation makes me think like how far-reaching and even to affect these whales the plastic industry is, and yeah, and ways to help to phase out single-use plastics. It can be something to kind of not drive more demand for oil, because that's what it's happening. There's going to be even more demand for plastics, and there's going to be more production of plastics, and that's going to drive even more drilling and fracking to cracking to make the plastic.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Josh. And you bring up renewables, and I'm clearly excited about the renewables, but a lot of researchers at St. Andrews University have been looking at the impacts of tidal energy wind farms that are in the oceans, also on the animals, because are we just trading one horrible thing for another? We think we have it all sorted, and maybe we're not putting as much out into the air, but what are we doing to the other living organisms? So it is just catch-22 after catch-22. I think that's appropriate based on the fact that we're talking about whales today. So yeah, it is such a conundrum. I always think of Jason's world with, policy shifts and the levers that we can and can't pull. The question that Jason put in the chat, thanks for that, Jason. I'm trying to, be situated in decolonization theory alongside bioacoustic theory, because these voices that have dwelled with these animals and with this environment for thousands of years have so much knowledge and probably know so much more than I could ever hope to know about what day-to-day life is like and what the needs are in these spaces. So my approach includes immense amounts of quantitative data gathering, because that's necessary. Again, to me, from everything I've seen thus far, science is what shifts policy in our current world, but the story changes hearts. So I don't know if I'll be welcomed. Most of the scientists with whom I've talked about this and sought ways to be in the Arctic have worked with the Inuit hunters. This is a great inroad for most scientists to study the narwhal, because not only do they know where they are, but they're happy to share the bounty, because the money that they're paid for their catches for the scientists helps alleviate what's occurred because of what colonization has done to their communities. So, note this is not judgment of the Inuit hunters in any way, but that's usually how the narwhals are captured for scientific study. And that's probably not the right path for me. So I'm seeking to go farther north. I may end up in Nunavut, because that's where it's easy to get to the narwhals, but I'd really like to go very far north to some of the settlements that nobody's paying attention to. And I'd like to hear the stories of the people who live with the animals, who depend on the animals, who have had thousands of years of stories told to them from all of their ancestors about the circle of life as they see it. So with those stories, and again, I may not be welcomed, I am the other, I acknowledge that, but I would like to, if I'm given the opportunity to hear their stories, take that qualitative data and combine it with the quantitative data so that I have a very thorough, very honest account of what's happening. So again, you do have to have the science to shift the policy, but what are we gonna do with the human hearts? I think that has to come into play as well too. So that's my plan.
Any other questions that we want to share? We have.
Well, thanks, Andrea. I had a similar question to Jason, so that's great to hear what you're planning to do. Yeah, and just a comment. I mean, it's definitely complicated. It sounds like a really interesting situation in the Arctic where indigenous people or locals want to preserve the area, whereas you have international international countries wanting to go in there for shipping or oil exploration, and that can be almost opposite compared to like where you might have in the tropics, where you have international pressure or wanting to conserve certain lands and local people not wanting to do that, but are more concerned about just living day to day and being able to feed themselves and stuff and not concerned as much about that. So yeah, it's an interesting difference, but then there's also like lots of other interesting thoughts about that question about like who owns the Arctic and like just things that are going on today in terms of nationalism. Is it good to have nationalism and people having kind of, okay, I own this chunk of land, or maybe that's not a good thing and can lead to wars, and maybe we should be more international and community globally oriented, but not the case if everybody's kind of working more towards oil exploration and natural resource exploitation and stuff. So anyway, interested to hear what your thoughts are about this.
Yeah, I was really touched. There was a conference a few months ago that included a couple of speakers from the Sami Council, and they are a permanent member of the Arctic Council, although again, the indigenous groups that are permanent members cannot enact laws, whereas the 8 member states can. So you have powerful entities like Russia and America able to enact laws, and you have the member groups unable to enact laws. So just think about that for a moment. But the speakers from the Sami Council were so incredibly gracious about the desire to, I guess recognition is probably, they've probably spent decades recognizing that their land has been colonized and dealing with that. So they're very open to what can we do together at this point and what's it going to take. And hey, sure, sovereign states, we'll take your money, just help us, you know? So it feels like in the Arctic, that's kind of to where we've arrived, because I don't know if we've reached the point of no return. And this is where, you know, Jason's expertise, I think, comes in, you know, from a policy standpoint. But if we can't back out of that, you know, I don't see greed being what it is. The powerful nations of the world saying, yeah, sure, we won't be here anymore. So how, and especially there's so much tension in the Arctic Council right now because of, you know, because of Russia, just to be, you know, I don't mean to be politically incorrect, but they are a member of the Arctic Council. They've actually had the chairmanship. And so how the power shifts now with the Arctic Council, who largely has controlled, even though it's a soft power entity, but really has controlled since, I mean, basically post-Cold War endeavors in the Arctic. Since that's kind of fraying, you know, who's going to jump in now and say, oh, we've got this? You probably all know, because it's so fun to talk about, that 4 countries now who are part of the Arctic Council have actually made a request to the United Nations to own the North Pole. And Russia put a titanium post on the seafloor at the North Pole in 2004. So, you know, where do we go from here? And clearly, you know, what I've recognized and what's so important, I think, for as an individual scholar, is I have a tiny, tiny little piece that I can contribute. And hopefully I'm looking at the situation objectively enough, although I have so many biases, but objectively enough to situate where I think I can do the most good. And that's probably what I need to focus on. But it is overwhelming when you start to think about, again, back to the levers, Jason, Denellen Meadows, who's pulling and pushing on what right now, on top of everything else that we are thinking about, you know, certainly as scholars, as humans, as people living in the United States, or at least situated in the United States in this moment.
Yeah, kind of made me wonder, like, you know, the idea of, you know, when you say that, you know, these powerful entities who have all the say, and then there's people who have been part of this council for a long, and you say indefinitely, and they pretty much have no say at all what happens or how that impacts. And it makes me think of, you know, who is being represented and you know, in this hierarchy of things. And I guess I was wondering also, if is there anything you can tell me, to the best of your knowledge, like when you talked about, you know, natural and unnatural sound, and talked about exploration and giving access to grants for all of this, to the best of your knowledge, do you think there'll be a time where, you know, we sort of you know, have a policy in place, or working on a policy in place that could help, you know, I don't know if that could help reduce the amount of exploration that we do within those certain areas, you know, like how can we get to a place where we can make policies to protect not only the indigenous people who rely on those areas for survival, and like you said, sort of decolonize, you know, those patterns, but find a way also to protect this unique species that you have talked about?
That's such a great question. I spend a lot of time in my head there and a lot of time researching that. There have been some amazing wins, you know, and although individual scientists I speak with in Canada might have different points of view, Canada is at least making a really good effort, it appears from the outside, to mitigate harm coming from acoustics. And this new project that was just launched here in Puget Sound, which is here in Washington, the state, not DC, is looking to do similar things that have occurred in Canada, where, and we already do have some laws in place where, you know, a large cargo vessel coming into the bay to port, it can't be going more than theoretically 9 knots per hour, but although they often are. The Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, oh my goodness, that was like an immense piece of legislation. But of course, that's here in the US. So that's the other thing, that comes up when you ask a question like that to me, is every place, whatever place means, has different laws or not. And, the Paris Accord was an effort to try to get everybody on the same page about what we're supposed to be doing, right? So we can save our planet. Clearly, you all have probably been reading the IPCC report. We're not all living up to it. It's a problem. How do you enact and enforce without accountability? So we make these, what we think of as these huge wins, quieting one bay, one port a little bit. Or there's in Massachusetts Bay, those of you, Mike, you probably know it well, there is a system that they have where they can detect and alert the captains of vessels coming into port there that there's a whale, like it'll trigger it and alert them with an alarm so that they know where that animal is, and they'll slow the vessel. So they slow the vessel down and deter, impact, so they don't hit the animal, which has happened so many times. So there are these amazing things going on, little tiny pieces all over the world. How do we put them all together and make it something really big? Every year, there's a huge conference to try to sort all of this out. So I know we could go on forever, and I noticed that it's like 6 o'clock your time, so time to go, right?
Thank you so much for your presentation, Andrea. I really appreciate it. So yeah, applause.
Thanks for the opportunity to spend time with all of you. It's really, really been fun to think about it from an international perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, and take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.